Book The World is for Sale, Chapter 2, The Godfather of Oil. On 25 April 1968, the President Daly's brief arrived on the desk of Lyndon B. Johnson, directly from the Central Intelligence Agency. The top-secret document is a succinct summary of the world news, the CIA's version of Reader's Digest. On this occasion, after updates on the war in Vietnam, the Soviet Union, and the development of ballistic missiles in China, the President's eye was led to an item about the geopolitics of oil that America's spy masters thought needed his attention. Israel is about set to start work on a 42-inch oil pipeline bypassing the Suez Canal, began the brief. It included a map showing the pipeline's route from Eilat, an Israeli port on the Red Sea, north through the country to the Mediterranean coast at Askelton. See map, there was a map in the book. The construction of the pipeline pointed to an alliance forged in oil and steel between Israel and a country that would go on to become its bitterest enemy, the CIA concluded. Iran. Iran is the only likely source of substantial quantities of petroleum for the pipeline. The construction of the pipeline and the CIA's interest in it were a demonstration of oil's increasingly important role in the world economy and its dependence on the favorable politics in the Middle East. For the American government, that was a growing concern. By the late 1960s and the early 1970s, a wealthier world was demanding vastly greater quantities of oil. Between 1948 and 1972, consumption tripled in the US, an unprecedented increase except when measured against what happening elsewhere. Oil demand in Western Europe over the same period increased 15-fold. In Japan, it grew by more than 100 times. At the same time, the Seven Sisters' grip on the market was looking increasingly shaky. The chain of events that had begun, with Weisser's trip to the Soviet Union in 1954, had made it easier for the oil-rich countries to sell their crude outside of the network of the large Western companies. The market had begun to open up, with Moscow selling its oil far below the posted prices set by the Seven Sisters. The erosion of the power of the Western corporate oligopoly had reached a key juncture in August 1960, with Soviet oil undermining their market dominance. Executives and Standard Oil of the New Jersey, a forerunner of ExxonMobil, had taken it upon themselves to cut their Middle East posted price by 7%, without consulting the governments of their countries that were producing it. The sheikhs were livid, resentful about the loss of income, and they became furious that they hadn't been consulted on the price cut. Oil-producing nations started agitating for action. A month later, the oil ministers of Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait gathered in Baghdad. After 4 days of deliberations, they announced on 14 September 1960 the birth of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC. It was the first step in a transformation of the energy industry that took place in the 1960s and 1970s. Increasingly assertive under the auspices of OPEC, countries began nationalizing their oil sources, and where foreign companies were allowed to stay, they were forced to hand over more profits and taxes to their hosts. The change marked the beginning of an era in which OPEC would turn the oil market and the world economy on its head, ending the dominance of the Seven Sisters for good and handing huge power to the commodity traders. As oil-producing countries nationalized their petroleum industries, the traders became essential conduits. To move, just a moment. It would increasingly be the traders and not the large oil companies who would determine who could buy or sell oil, empowering the new petrostates of the Middle East, Africa, and Latin America. As a result, the traders became the pioneers of shift that was happening across the world, from a carefully controlled economy under the stewardship of a largely American oligopoly to a free-for-all in which the market was God. Over the course of the next period, next decade, the oil price would fluctuate widely, redrawing the contours of the global economy amid political upheaval everywhere from the US to Iran. And there was one trader who, more than anyone, saw the possibilities of this new era and grasped them with all his might. His name was Marc Rich. Then a young trader at Philip Brothers, Rich had just discovered that what Weiser had shown more than a decade earlier, that crude oil could be traded. He would go on to become the master of the global oil market. But his training grounds was the pipeline between Eilat and Askelton that was being built by Israel with secret Iranian support. The two countries were strange bedfellows even before the Islamic Revolution in 1979, but they were united by their economic interests. Iran had oil to sell and Israel was a buyer, but both countries wanted a way to get oil from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean without having it go through the Suez Canal. They had been working on the pipeline in secret for several years, but had made limited progress. Everything changed in 1967 when, amid escalating tensions, Israel launched a surprise attack on Egypt and Syria. Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser responded by closing the Suez Canal. The war was over within 6 days, but the canal wouldn't reopen until 1975. The shutdown was so sudden that 15 vessels were trapped inside the canal, unable to leave for 8 years. The closure of the Suez Canal had a major impact on the global trade. The waterway was then, and remains today, a crucial shipping route for the oil market, the most direct route to deliver oil to Europe and to the US from the massive fields of Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab United. When Nasser closed it, Middle Eastern oil was forced to travel all the way around the Horn of Africa, delaying deliveries and adding significant costs. Iran and Israel responded by fast-tracking their plans for a pipeline that would span the 254 kilometers between Israel's Red Sea and Mediterranean coasts. Bypassing the canal, envoys from the two countries met in secret to thrash out the details. After the personal intervention of the Shah, the two countries agreed to create a jointly owned entity, the Trans-Asiatic Company, based in Switzerland, to build and manage the new oil pipeline. The Iranians used a shell company in Liechtenstein to hide their ownership of half of the company, while the Israelis used the Panamanian entity. Even today, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz describes the company as the most secretive firm in Israel. Into the shadowy world stepped the commodity traders. Oil importers in Europe were worried about handling oil from the pipeline, fearful of antagonizing Arab countries that were boycotting Israel. The Iranians and the Israelis needed help to keep their new trade route flowing, And who better to turn to than the new breed of traders who, equipped with little more than a telephone and sharp wits, the ability to think or reason, sharp wits, could buy and sell oil anywhere in the world. It was the perfect opportunity for an ambitious and aggressive trader like Marc Rich, the man who would become the godfather of the oil market. Was born Marcel David Rich to a Jewish family in Antwerp, Belgium, in 1934. His father, who made a living trading textiles and shoes, had grown up in Germany, so young Marcel grew up speaking German and French. His early years, like so many of the Philip brothers traders of the era, were shaped by the rise of Nazism in Europe. In May 1940, his father packed the family into a black Citroën, bought specially for the purpose of drove to the family into France, just a week before the German army marched into Antwerp. From France, they managed to board a ship to Morocco, where they spent several months in a refugee camp. Eventually, they managed to get visas for the US. And in 1941, at the age of 6 and speaking not a word of English, Marcel Rich arrived in America. The family first lived with an aunt in New York, then moved to Philadelphia, then Kansas City. As a result, Marc Rich, the Americanized name he had taken for himself, attended a different school virtually every year. From this point onwards, Rich had a feeling, which he never lost, of being an outsider, and it was also during the period that he rediscovered a passion for business. By the late 40s, the family had moved back to New York, and Rich was spending his spare time helping out with his father's business importing jute from burlap bags. Writing in his high school yearbook, the teenage Rich already knew what his dream job was: business. Rich enrolled at a New York university but never graduated. Instead, thanks to an acquaintance of his father's, he got a position as a trainee at Philip Brothers. In 1954, aged 19, he started working at a company office at 7th Pipe Street, a skyscraper just around the corner from the Wall Street in the financial district. Like all the trainees, he began in the mailroom. He wasn't to be there long, however. Rich had a talent and a drive that was hard to miss. He was a great colleague, a very bright guy, multilingual and enormously hard-working, recalls Felix Posen, who worked with Rich at Philip Brothers and later at Marc Rich and Co. Another of his contemporaries remembered Rich always arriving first in the morning, greeting the other juniors with a sarcastic good afternoon as they tramped in at 8:30 a.m. It wasn't long before he had moved up from the mailroom and was working with one of the company's major senior traders. Already at this early stage, he showed the combination of business acumen and appetite for taking risks that would make him fantastically successful. Rich took responsibility for trading mercury, a niche commodity unimportant enough to be given to a junior trader. Mercury had historically been used to extract silver in thermometers and to treat syphilis. By the 1950s, it was also being used in batteries, particularly in military equipment. Rich became convinced that demand would rise rapidly, and he set about negotiating with producers to secure supplies. With Washington full of warnings about resource Scarcity. He was soon proved right. A massive government stockpiling program launched in mid-1954 mandated purchases of an amount of mercury equivalent to almost a third of global pulp production. Marc Rich's mercury was suddenly in high demand.